Hi everybody, welcome back. I'm back in my usual spot in the restaurant over in my plant corner. I hope you enjoyed our month of behind the scenes with my admin days, with our front of house service staff, with our kitchen and back of house staff, and then our highlighting our coffee. It was fun to invite y'all into more of the day-to-day and into our whole team instead of just looking at my face or hearing my voice. So I hope that you enjoyed that. If you have any questions about our operations, always feel free to drop them in the comments below, and we would love to fill you in on more of what goes on here with our team. But we're gonna step back into more disability, employment, education, advocacy content this month. And today, my original plan was to talk about disability euphemisms. And as I was doing more research about that, I encountered another term called dysphemism. Dysphemism. It's a new word for me, so I'm still learning it. But there are a lot of applications for a dysphemism in the context of disability language. So we are going to kind of talk about the difference between a euphemism and a dysphemism, and how that relates to disability culture and language, and some ways that we can push against both of those things. So, as you may already be aware and familiar, a euphemism is a term or a phrase designed to be a softer or more gentle, less offensive approach to describing something that people may take offense or be have more emotional weight or connotation towards. A lot of times culturally, we use euphemisms around the areas of death, around the areas of bodily functions or fluids, and around the area of sex. We've talked about this a little bit in one of our past videos, so some of this may be information that you've heard before. But there are euphemisms that have been created to talk about disability as well. Part of the problem with that, while the intention of being respectful and non-offensive is a good and noble intention, when the deeper meaning there is that we think disability is something that is offensive or needs to be talked about in softer language, all of that implies that there may be something wrong with disability in the first place, which can be harmful and dehumanizing and degrading in multiple aspects. So even though the intention itself may have good themes or elements, a lot of what goes unrecognized or is subconscious in that intention is that we have a bias that's most likely unrecognized, but it's an implicit bias that there's something wrong or negative or offensive about disability. And so we need to soften it, cover it up, come up with a different term, etc., which takes away from a disabled person being able to just exist in the world and with their disability without there being a stigma or stereotype attached to it. A dysphemism, dysphemism, D-Y-S-P-H-E-M-I-S-M, dysphemism is, like I'm at a spelling bee over here, dysphemism. I would flunk a spelling bee 100%. That is my weakness academically. But a dysphemism is when a euphemism, which the goal, remember there, is intended to not offend someone. A dysphemism is when a euphemism has turned into a derogatory term and is now used with unpleasant terms or associations attached to it. So the reason that we're talking about this is there are some disability euphemisms that culturally have migrated into the dysphemism category over the years. I'm gonna just point out a few euphemisms that get used a lot, and then we'll talk about which ones we feel like have been pulled into the dysphemism category. But special needs, well, actually, let's go historically. I've been doing a lot of research on this today, and it's been super fascinating to me. But initially, disabilities were referred to more in terms of afflicted by, a person afflicted by, and then whatever the disability was. There were a lot of spiritual connections and associations with this idea of being afflicted by, that as humans we suffer from, are afflicted by. It's something that has been given to us by God to deal with in our lifetime for no apparent reason, but it's designed to potentially teach us a lesson, to teach other people lessons, etc. There's no escaping from it, but there's no real need to conquer it either. It's just something that you live with, but still in somewhat of a, I think, pitying stance. That terminology of afflicted by eventually turned into handicap, which I was doing some research on today because I was like, where did that term come from initially? And it seems like the term was born out of, in horse racing, they would handicap the faster horses by weighing them down with stones. And then that term started being associated with disabilities and this idea of being handicapped in the race of life, kind of taking that analogy or framework from horse racing, where horses were handicapped in the race, to a human being handicapped in the race of life. And that's where you start to see culturally this idea that a disability is something to overcome. And there's a lot of celebration or affirmation or praise that's given when we witness a disabled human overcome an aspect of their disability or an obstacle in life because of the disability that they have. That's still pretty prevalent today, and that'll be a separate video because there's a lot of conversation and discussion that we can have around that. But then, legally at least, the term changed from handicapped to disabled. In the interim, or like, not the interim, but I guess, well, maybe some, in that crossover, you see the introduction of special needs, and that has been used fairly prevalently, but not for very long historically, and there's no legal or medical documentation that supports the term special needs. That really does fall into the category of a euphemism. It's a term that's been coined societally to be a softer or less offensive approach to disability. That is not really the way that has unfolded, and I think that special needs has crossed over into this category of dysphemism, where it has and can be used in a derogatory or unpleasant term. So there's kind of two different reasons why we discourage the use of special needs. One is that it's not always used in a way that's actually respectful and caring towards a disabled individual. Two, it goes back to this idea of if you're using a euphemism to, even if you have the best of intentions, if you're using a euphemism to talk about disability, then there is the underlying assumption that there's something wrong with disability or being disabled in the first place, and we're trying to push against that stereotype and stigma because it's just not true. Legally and medically, special needs doesn't hold any weight. So disability is the current, like all the disability laws, politically, from a government standpoint, from a medical standpoint, in terms of disability rights and funding medical care, special needs is not legally binding or holds weight and responsibility, but the term disability does. So that maybe is not relevant to this video, but was something that I did find interesting today. So other euphemisms, back on the original topic here. Other euphemisms that are oftentimes used around disability, aside from special needs, are differently abled, disabled with a capital A, so emphasizing the abled portion, challenged, handicapable, and then a lot of times when talking about a person with a disability versus a person without a disability, we get into language of typical, normal, atypical, abnormal, regular, not regular. That is all harmful and damaging, but is a lot more common than you might be aware of, or even if you've noticed in your own language when you're trying to differentiate between a person with a disability and without, that you may be tempted to say normal or regular. So being mindful of that. Essentially, the bottom line is disability is normal. It's a normal part of the human condition. Experiencing limitations is a normal part of being human. This will also be another video, a lot of the limitations that disabled humans face in our world are because of our world and not because of the person. Are because of our world and not because of the person. Let that sink in for just a second. A lot of the disabilities and limitations that people experience because of a disability are there because of the way our world is constructed and set up, and not because of the human themselves. An example of that could be that a person may be considered to be disabled because they are deaf. They don't have the same access that a hearing person has in our culture, so that's considered to be a disability. Or you could look at it another way, that our world is just not set up to be very accommodating and accessible to people who are deaf, so therefore they experience some limitations. It's not because there's anything wrong with not being able to hear. It's because our society has not adjusted and been accommodating to people who are deaf. There's a lot of different disabilities that can fit under that umbrella and into that category. To sum it up, there's a euphemism, which is a softer definition or phrase that's meant to not offend. There's a dysphemism, which is a euphemism that has turned into a derogatory or unpleasant term. In the disability community, we experience both of those. There's a problem with euphemisms because it implies that a disability is offensive or that there's something wrong with having a disability. That gets reinforced when those euphemisms turn into dysphemisms and are actually used in derogatory and unpleasant or harmful ways. And language around disability is constantly evolving. It has changed a lot over, the past 100 years. Hopefully it will continue to change more in the future. Our understanding around language, the way that we use it, and recognizing that disability is a very normal part of the human experience. It is okay to state something for exactly what it is. while also acknowledging the nuance and the fact that a lot of disabilities exist in the way that they do because we as a society are structured to accommodate humans without disabilities and therefore impose, in some ways, disabilities onto other people. And so what does it look like for us as a business, as a community, as a world to actually shift the way that we do things so that humans with disabilities have the same opportunities and the same access? What will that do in changing language of the future? I don't know. But I'm excited to step into and see that. So, please avoid using terms such as special needs, handy-capable, differently abled, etc. Avoid normal, abnormal, regular, typical, etc. For now, person with a disability, person without a disability, disabled human, non-disabled human, speaking about things in neutral, observational tones is helpful. And maybe question your use of euphemisms, not just in the disability world, but in other aspects of your life too. What does it look like to state something for exactly what it is without any shame? That's it. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. Oh, I'm in the tree. What was I thinking?